say so. We have two enemies. We have the outside enemy, and then we have the enemy from within. And the enemy from within, in my opinion, is more dangerous than China, Russia.
And the enemy within, by which Donald Trump means his critics and opponents here at home. For years now, Donald Trump has been pushing the idea that there are domestic threats that are as big of a challenge for the United States as its adversaries abroad. Now the Trump administration has released its official 2026 United States counterterrorism strategy, which reads less like an actual strategy and more like an effort to put Donald Trump's conspiracies, grudges, and grievances to paper. In The Atlantic, Tom Nichols writes that it, quote, frames everything the administration doesn't like as terrorism and any actions it has already taken as counterterrorism. Its simplistic formulations loudly signal the Trump administration's incompetence to the entire world. Foreign adversaries are unlikely to be intimidated. Instead, they might even take some pleasure in knowing that the American government thinks drug dealers, transgender activists, and a bunch of street goons calling themselves Antifa are as much a threat as transnational terror organizations and their state sponsors. I want to bring into the conversation staff writer at The Atlantic, Tom Nichols. He is a professor emeritus of national security affairs at the U.S. Naval War College. Also joining us, former DHS chief of staff during Trump's first term, Miles Taylor, and Rican General Hertling are still with me. Tom, talk to us about, just as a reference point, what would a real counterterrorism strategy look like versus what we're seeing here?
Well, a real counterterrorism strategy would identify threats, prioritize them, explain to the reader where they come from, why they're dangerous, what instruments of national power we're going to bring to bear on those threats, which agencies will take which parts of that, how we intend to counter their threats, the risks involved, the costs involved. That's what you would do with any strategy. You identify a problem, how you bring your efforts to bear, what it would cost, what the risks are, and so on. This does none of that. This kind of was like, it's like they took a bunch of words from terrorism and counterterrorism documents and threw them together like a bag of refrigerator magnets, and then made a counterterrorism strategy out of it. But this isn't a strategy; it's a screed. It's like, as I said in the piece, it's more like a bunch of notes for a campaign speech.
Yeah, it's funny you say campaign speech because the person who drafted this paper, Miles, was Sebastian Gorka, who worked in the first Trump administration. From your background, your expertise, is this someone who should be crafting our national security strategy?
No, I mean, there's a reason that Seb Gorka was fired the first time from the White House. As I remember when my boss, John Kelly, was DHS secretary, and he went to the White House as White House chief of staff. The very first phone call I got when Kelly went to the White House was from Sebastian Gorka, who wanted to plead to keep his job at the White House. Now, he didn't keep his job at the White House because I think a lot of people felt like that was not the right person to be crafting America's counterterrorism strategy. Now, I was very involved in writing that first counterterrorism strategy for the Trump administration. And the irony is the White House refused to talk about domestic terrorism in the first counterterrorism strategy, even though we at DHS and the FBI said there was surging domestic terrorist activity, especially from far-right militia groups. And now here we are, fast forward to Donald Trump's second term. Look, they're talking about domestic terrorism finally, because they've decided they want to politicize it. They don't want to focus on where the threat's actually coming from. They want to use this strategy to reorient the federal government to go after the president's enemies. I do not say that lightly. This is the most sweeping re-architecture of the U.S. federal government to go after political enemies that we have ever seen. And we were talking about thousands and thousands of people who are being taken off actual threats and put on looking into left-wing groups because the president has said so. That's really bad for our national security. I don't care if you vote Democrat or Republican or independent. This is very dangerous, and this strategy cements that approach.
And I'm going to pick up on that point that you just mentioned there, Miles, about the left wing, Tom, because you, in your piece, you write about this. You write violent left-wing extremists, including anarchists and anti-fascists. You say, who could these be? Communists, perhaps? Not quite. The document identified them as anti-American, radically pro-transgender and anarchists, and promises to map them at home, identify their membership, map their ties to international organizations like Antifa, and use law enforcement tools to cripple them operationally before they can maim or kill the innocent. What's the Trump administration actually saying here, Tom? I mean, Chris Wray, the former FBI director, said this about Antifa in 2020. Listen.
So Antifa is a real thing. It's not a group or an organization. It's a movement or an ideology, maybe one way of thinking of it. And we have quite a number, and I've said this consistently since my first time appearing before this committee. We have any number of properly predicated investigations into what we would describe as violent anarchist extremists, and some of those individuals self-identify with Antifa.
So what do you make of what the former FBI, Trump's own FBI director, said about that in 2020 versus what they're saying now in this report?
Well, what Chris Wray said in 2020 is reality. That people use this as a label, as a brand, as a slogan. Yeah, there are guys, that's why I mentioned, street goons. There are guys who say, we're Antifa, and they show up in, balaclavas and, to street protests. But the idea of, they notice in the report, they capitalize Antifa like it's a thing, like it's Spectre or Thrush or something, that it's this, or Chaos, it's this evil organization. When in fact, you have, grandmothers who say, I'm Antifa because I can't stand Trump. I mean, this is one of the reasons that I, for years, told people that this was a dumb word to use, that the administration would seize on it like it's some sort of huge transnational organization with tentacles everywhere. But what they're really saying is anybody who identifies on the political left, who uses that word, we're creating a predicate for somehow labeling them as a terrorist. It's a very weird document, like pro-transgender, anarchist, Antifa. Again, it's kind of a Mad Libs approach, but I think Miles' point is right, that it's meant to basically take everybody that Donald Trump doesn't like, anybody who opposes Donald Trump's administration, and throw them all into a big basket that says left-wing terrorists that we can now go after. I think it was done incompetently and stupidly. I think, as Miles points out, Seb Gorka is not exactly a sparkling talent in the counterterrorism field, but now there's an official U.S. document that at least lays down some kind of predicate for doing this.
Yeah, and speaking of sparkling talents, let's combine this strategy with who's leading the FBI. That is Kash Patel, somebody facing allegations of unexplained absences after nights out, partying, emotional outbursts, Miles. You have an attorney general who's also now pursuing the people on Trump's enemies list. He boasts about that openly, and there's conflict with Iran. It's not a pretty picture if you're a national security official who's assessing threats across this country and thinking your leadership is really on top of things.
No, not at all. And according to recent reports, the team that's focused on these politically sensitive investigations has been dubbed internally the Payback Squad. I mean, it is like Kash Patel is auditioning to be the person who's recognized as the heir of Herbert Hoover. And, it is taking our eye off the ball of very serious threats. I mean, we have seen prosecutor after prosecutor leave DOJ, agent after agent leave the FBI, and say that their focus, their eyes were taken off the ball to things like immigration and away from actual counterterrorism, actual counterintelligence cases against the Russians and the Chinese, very important cybersecurity investigations, and forced to focus on the president's political priorities. That's not the type of law enforcement that the American people want to be paying for.
Yeah, so Rick, to pick up on that point, Russia, China, Iran, they're probably watching this and thinking this administration is consumed with transgender activists as the biggest threat to it. And they're probably sitting here figuring out how or where to carry out the next cyber attack against the U.S., what, infrastructure they could potentially target. And we're worried about Antifa and transgender groups.
They couldn't be more delighted about that because we're taking the eye off the ball. But I want to pick up one thing about the document because I did have a look at it before the show, and Tom noted this too. In the first 3 pages, I found 2 grammatical mistakes and 1 spelling error. I'm sure there are other spelling errors and grammatical mistakes as well. If you look at all the spelling errors and grammatical mistakes that the White House has made since George Washington, and put that compared to the number of spelling errors and grammatical mistakes that the Trump White House has made, the Trump White House is probably 6 times that. And what that also tells the Chinese and the Russians is they're not serious. Just because you make a spelling error doesn't mean you're necessarily wrong about your counterterrorism strategy, but it might make you think maybe you're not taking it that seriously or doing
reread
research.
And proofread.
Yeah, because it's a very bizarre document, and they should correct those mistakes online.
That's the editor in you, I think. That's
yes,
coming
exactly.
out, right?
I have more credentials as an editor than a counterterrorist.